I'm not the bride you paid for, she whispered at the altar. So why did the cowboy still say, I do? The church door slammed against the wind, candles flickering as dust swirled through the aisle. Her fingers trembled inside borrowed gloves, the fabric too tight, the ring too cold. He didn't step back, didn't even blink. Just watched her like he already knew something no one else did. The preacher's voice faltered. Outside, a horse kicked hard against its post, iron ringing sharp in the silence. And still, he didn't stop the wedding. Tell me, what would you do if you were standing in her place? The wind came in low off the flats, dragging red dust through the streets of Dustfall Ridge and rattling the loose boards along the church walls. By the time the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the whole town had taken on that dull, copper glow that came before night settled in for good. The church door groaned as it swung open. A strip of light cut across the dirt outside, then closed again with a slow, tired sound. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and old wood. Caleb Ward stood at the front, one hand resting near his belt, hat tucked under his arm. He didn't shift his weight, didn't look around. Just stared ahead at the rough plank wall behind the pulpit, like there was nothing in the room worth his time. A man could tell things about him without asking. The gray at his temples, the way he held still too long, the space he kept between himself and everyone else, the kind of man who had buried something and never dug it back up. Behind him, boots scraped. Low whispers passed between folks sitting in the pews, not loud enough to be rude, just enough to say they were watching. The preacher cleared his throat. We'll keep this brief. Nobody argued. The girl stepped forward. Her dress didn't quite fit the way it should have. Sleeves pulled a little too tight at the wrists. The hem carried dust from the road. She kept her chin level, though. Eyes forward, hands still at her sides. Ivy Bennett. She stopped a few feet from Caleb. He didn't look at her right away. Just breathed once, slow, then turned his head. That's when he saw it. Not panic, not softness either. Something steadier than that. The preacher opened his worn book, pages thin as onion skin. We are gathered here. The wind hit the side of the building, hard enough to make the walls creak. A candle flickered. Someone shifted in the back row. Henry Bennett stood near the last pew, hat in both hands, turning it slow like he didn't know what else to do with them. He kept his eyes down, never once looked at his daughter. The preacher spoke a few more words, but most of them drifted off into the sound of the wind pressing against the boards. Then he stopped, looked up. Do you take this man? Ivy's breath caught, just once, barely there. The kind of thing a person might miss if they weren't already watching her close. Caleb was. Her voice came low, not trembling, not loud either. I'm not the woman you were promised. The room stilled. No one moved. Not even the wind, it seemed. A chair creaked somewhere in the back. Someone whispered a name, Lila, but it didn't carry far. Caleb didn't react the way folks expected. No anger, no step back, no question thrown across the room. He just looked at her. Longer than a man should look at a stranger on a day like this, taking in the line of her shoulders, the dust on her shoes, the way she didn't turn away, like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. The preacher shifted, uncertain now. Miss Bennett? No answer. Henry's hands tightened around his hat. Still, he said nothing. The silence stretched until it felt like something might crack. Caleb finally moved, just enough to straighten his stance. His voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used much. Say your vows. It wasn't loud, but it settled in the room heavier than anything that had been said before. A woman in the second row drew in a breath. Someone else muttered under their breath. But no one stepped forward. No one stopped it. Ivy blinked once. Then she turned slightly toward the preacher. "I do." The words hung there, plain and simple. Caleb didn't look away. When it came his turn, he didn't hesitate either. "I do." The preacher closed the book quicker than he'd opened it. Then, by the authority, another gust slammed into the church, rattling the windows. But the words were said. The thing was done. Caleb reached for his hat, settled it on his head with a practiced motion. He didn't offer his arm, didn't touch her. Just turned and walked toward the door. For a moment, Ivy stayed where she was. Then she followed. The door opened again, letting the red dusk spill inside. Outside, the wind took hold of her dress and pulled it sideways as she stepped down into the dirt. Caleb was already at his horse. He untied the reins, checked the saddle strap like he always did. Routine, like nothing about the last few minutes had changed a thing. He glanced back at her once. "Ride's long," he said. "We leave now." No question in it. Ivy nodded. Behind them, the church door closed again, with that same tired sound. Henry Bennett stepped out onto the porch, but he didn't call after her. Didn't move from where he stood. He just watched as Caleb mounted up and Ivy climbed onto the wagon beside him. The wheels creaked as they started forward. Dust rose behind them, catching the last light of day. No one followed, and no one tried to stop them. The road out of Dustfall Ridge stretched ahead, empty and quiet, leading straight into the dark hills where the wind never really settled. Ivy kept her hands folded tight in her lap. Caleb didn't look at her again. Not once. But something had shifted. You could feel it in the space between them, like a line had been crossed, and neither of them could step back over it. The wagon rolled on into the fading light. The road out of Dustfall Ridge turned rough not long after the last building disappeared behind them. Ruts cut deep into the ground. Dry brush scraped against the wheels. The sky darkened fast once the sun slipped behind the hills, leaving only a thin line of red along the horizon. Caleb drove without speaking. The leather reins rested steady in his hands. Every now and then he clicked his tongue at the horses, guiding them along a narrow trail that climbed toward the darker outline of the mountains. Ivy sat beside him, back straight, hands folded tight in her lap. The wind had settled some, but the air still carried dust. It clung to her sleeves, to the edge of her collar. She didn't ask how far, didn't ask anything at all. By the time they reached the ranch, the last light was gone. It sat alone at the edge of a rocky stretch of land, tucked between low hills that blocked most of the wind. A single lantern hung near the door, its flame small but steady. The barn stood off to the side, leaning just enough to show its age. No other houses, no neighbors, just open land and silence. Caleb climbed down first. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. He tied off the reins, checked the harness, then turned toward the house without looking at her. "Come on." That was all. Inside, the air held the smell of old wood and something faintly bitter, coffee left too long on the stove. A small table sat near the center of the room. One chair, a second one leaned against the wall, one leg shorter than the others. A narrow bed stood in the corner. No decorations, no pictures, nothing soft. Caleb set his hat down on a hook by the door. He moved through the room like he knew every board that creaked and every one that didn't. Ivy stepped in behind him, closing the door slow so it wouldn't slam. He gestured toward the bed. "You take it." She looked at it, then at him. "And you?" "I'll take the floor." He didn't wait for her answer, just bent to unroll a thin blanket near the hearth, like it had been decided long before she arrived. Ivy nodded once, though he wasn't looking. She set her small bag down by the bed, ran her hand over the rough blanket. It smelled clean, at least. Sun-dried. Neither of them spoke again that night. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind shifted, softer now against the walls. Caleb lay on his back, one arm over his eyes. Ivy sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before lying down. She didn't pull the blanket up all the way. Just enough. They listened to the same silence, from different places. Morning came cold. A pale light slipped through the cracks in the wall, laying thin lines across the floor. Caleb was already up, pulling on his boots when Ivy opened her eyes. He didn't say good morning, just stepped outside. She heard the bucket at the well, the creak of rope, water sloshing into a pail. Ivy sat up slowly. The bed felt unfamiliar under her. Not uncomfortable, just not hers. She folded the blanket back neat, ran her fingers along the edge to straighten it. Then she stood and looked around the room again. Still nothing soft. Still nothing that spoke of anyone staying long. She found a broom leaning behind the door, took it without asking. By the time Caleb came back in, carrying water in one hand and a sack of feed in the other, the floor had been swept clean. Dust pushed into a neat pile near the corner. He stopped just inside the doorway, looked at it, then at her. She didn't say anything, just kept working. He set the bucket down near the stove, poured water into a dented tin pot, lit the fire without a word. Breakfast was quiet. He placed a bowl in front of her, beans, thick and salted, a piece of cornbread beside it. She nodded once. Thank you. He didn't answer, just sat across from her, eating slow, eyes on his bowl. The sound of the spoon against tin filled the room. Later that morning, a noise came from the yard. A sharp, sudden thud. Caleb stepped outside quick. Ivy followed. One of the horses had broken loose from its post. A young stallion, restless, kicking at the dirt. Its rope dragged behind it, catching on a fence post, snapping loose with a crack. The animal reared, front hooves striking the air. Caleb moved toward it, careful. One step at a time. The horse lunged sideways, too fast. Its hind legs swung out, close enough to catch him if he'd been half a step slower. Ivy moved without thinking. She grabbed the loose rope as it whipped past, wrapped it once around her hand, then pulled hard, angling the line to the side just enough to turn the horse's head. Easy, she said under her breath. Not loud, just steady. The stallion fought it for a second, then another. Then its head dipped. Just enough. Caleb stepped in and took hold of the reins. They stood there a moment, both of them holding the same animal. Then it stilled. He tied it off again, tighter this time. Neither of them spoke right away. The wind brushed past, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. Caleb glanced at her hand. The rope had left a red mark across her palm. You done that before, he said. She flexed her fingers once. Had to. That was it. He nodded, slow. Something in his face shifted. Not much. Just enough to notice. They walked back toward the house. Halfway there, he stopped. Why didn't you run? She looked at him. Like your sister. The question hung between them. Ivy didn't look away. Because someone had to stay. No anger, no defense, just the truth, set down plain. Caleb held her gaze a second longer than before. Then he turned and kept walking. Inside, the silence felt different. Not lighter, but not quite the same as before. They rode into town 3 days later. The sky hung low, pale and washed out, the kind that promised wind by afternoon. Caleb drove the wagon slower this time. Not because the road demanded it, just because he did. Ivy sat beside him again, hands resting loose now, not clenched like before. She wore the same dress, though cleaner, sleeves rolled once at the wrist. A faint mark still crossed her palm where the rope had burned her skin. Dustfall Ridge looked no different. Same crooked storefronts, same hitching posts leaning at odd angles. The general store door stood open, a bell hanging loose above it, tapping soft against the frame with each shift of the breeze. But people noticed them this time. Eyes followed the wagon. Conversations paused, then picked back up in lower voices. A man outside the saloon leaned on the rail, watching them pass without trying to hide it. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the store. "I won't be long," he said. Ivy nodded once. He stepped down, boots hitting the dirt. Didn't offer a hand. Didn't look back. Inside, the store smelled of flour and tobacco. Shelves lined with tins and sacks, everything worn but in its place. Keller, the storekeeper, looked up from behind the counter. "Didn't expect to see you so soon, Caleb." Caleb set a small folded paper on the counter. A list. Salt, coffee, a spool of thread. Keller glanced at it, then past him, toward the door. "That your wife out there?" Caleb didn't answer right away. "Something like that." Keller let out a short breath, like he had more to say but chose not to. As he gathered the items, the back door creaked open. Marshal Owen Pike stepped in, hat low, coat carrying dust from the road. He paused when he saw Caleb. "Ward?" "Marshal." Owen stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough. "Heard about that wedding." Caleb didn't react. Owen's eyes shifted toward the door. "Papers came through my desk yesterday. Didn't sit right." Caleb's jaw tightened, just a fraction. "What kind of papers?" "Marriage filings, land transfers tied to it." Owen leaned in slightly. "Name on them isn't hers." Caleb said nothing. Owen straightened. "Just thought you should know." Keller slid the goods across the counter, the sound of tin against wood filling the space. Caleb paid in coins. Exact, no extra. When he stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. Ivy sat where he'd left her. She didn't ask what took so long. He climbed up, took the reins, and turned the wagon back toward the road out. They rode in silence. Halfway back, the wind shifted harder, pushing against the wagon from the side. Ivy adjusted her coat, reaching across herself to hold it closed. That's when something slipped loose. A folded paper, worn at the edges, slid from inside her sleeve and dropped between the boards. Caleb saw it. He stopped the wagon without a word, reached down, picked it up. Ivy's hand moved quick, but not quick enough. "Don't," she started. Too late. He unfolded it. The paper cracked at the crease. Ink bled slightly where it had gotten damp once and dried again. His eyes moved over the lines. Names. Signatures. Silas Crowe. A transfer of land tied to a marriage agreement. Conditions written plain. His name was there. Not as a man, as part of it. He read it twice and then once more. The wind kept moving around them, tugging at the edges of the paper. Ivy stood up in the wagon, reaching for it. "Give it back." He didn't look at her. Not yet. When he did, it was slow. Like something had settled in him that hadn't been there before. "So, I wasn't a husband," he said, voice low. He held the paper out, not offering it, just letting it hang between them. "Just part of a deal." Ivy's hand closed around it. She pulled it back, folding it tight like she could hide it again. "I wasn't," she started, then stopped. The words didn't come. Caleb turned forward, picked up the reins. The wagon moved again. The rest of the ride passed without a sound. Back at the ranch, he unloaded the supplies alone. Set them inside without asking for help. Ivy stood by the door, hands empty. That night, the fire burned low. He set a bowl on the table for her like before. Didn't sit. Ate standing, back half turned. When he finished, he carried his blanket to the far side of the room, near the door. He pulled it down and lay there, instead of by the hearth. Ivy watched him once, then looked away. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers, he got up, walked to the door, opened it. Cold air slid in. He stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Ivy stayed where she was. The room felt bigger now, quieter. She sat at the table for a long time, the folded paper resting under her hand. Then she stood, walked to the door, opened it just enough to step out. The night had settled deep over the land. The sky stretched wide, stars sharp and clear above the dark outline of the hills. Caleb sat on the porch step, elbows on his knees. He didn't turn when she came out, didn't speak. Ivy stayed near the door, didn't step closer. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dust and cold stone. After a while, she sat down too, not beside him, a few feet away, far enough to keep the space, close enough to feel it. Neither of them said a word. The silence held. Heavier now. Different. The silence didn't break the next morning. It settled deeper. Caleb was already outside when the first light came through the cracks in the wall. Ivy found the fire half dead and stirred it back to life with a few small sticks, blowing slow until the embers caught. She poured water into the pot, measured coffee without thinking. The motions came easier now, like her hands had already learned the place. Outside, a hammer struck wood. Once, then again. She stepped out onto the porch. Caleb stood near the fence line, replacing a broken rail. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms dusted with dirt. He worked steady, not looking toward the house. Something in the ground caught her eye. Hoofprints, fresh. Not one horse, several. They cut across the dry dirt near the edge of the property, deep enough to leave a clear shape even after the night wind. Ivy followed them with her eyes. They circled wide, came close, then pulled away. Watching. Caleb noticed her standing there, followed her gaze. He didn't say anything, just set the hammer down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked over. He crouched, pressing his fingers into one of the prints. Still firm. Not from yesterday, he said. Ivy didn't ask who. She already knew. The rest of the morning passed without talk. Caleb checked the rifle leaning by the door, opened the chamber, closed it again. Set it within reach, not hidden this time. Ivy moved through the house quieter than before. She folded the blanket, swept the floor again, though it didn't need it. Around noon, the wind picked up. Dust rolled low across the ground. Then came the sound. Hooves. Slow. Not hurried. Not lost. Coming straight in. Caleb stepped onto the porch before the riders came into view. He didn't reach for the rifle yet. Just stood there, one hand resting near his belt. Ivy came to the doorway behind him. 3 men rode in. At the front sat Silas Crowe. Clean coat, dark hat pulled low. The kind of man who didn't look like he belonged in the dirt, but somehow owned most of it anyway. The 2 behind him stayed a half step back, watching everything. Silas slowed his horse as he came to a stop. His eyes moved over Caleb first, then past him, landing on Ivy. A thin smile touched his mouth. "Well," he said, Seems I've found what was misplaced. Caleb didn't move. You're a long way from town, he said. Silas shrugged slightly. Business travels. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it up just enough to show the seal. Legal matter, he added. That marriage of yours, it doesn't hold. The wind pushed against them, lifting dust into the air between the men. Caleb's eyes flicked once to the paper, then back to Silas. Doesn't change where she stands. Silas let out a short laugh. It does, actually. She was never yours to begin with. Behind him, one of the men shifted in the saddle, hand brushing the handle of his gun. Ivy stepped forward. Not far, just enough to stand beside Caleb instead of behind him. Silas noticed. His smile tightened. You should come along easy, he said to her. Save yourself trouble. Ivy didn't answer right away. She reached into her coat. Caleb's hand moved just slightly, but he stopped when he saw what she pulled out. A small notebook. Worn edges. Leather cracked from use. She held it up. I kept records, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. Silas's expression shifted, just for a second. Then it hardened again. Of what? Everything, she said. Names, land deals, payments you didn't put on paper. The wind caught the edge of the book, flipping a few pages. Silas's men exchanged a look. Silas laughed again, but it didn't carry the same way. You think that means something out here? Ivy met his eyes. It will somewhere. The space between them tightened. Silas lowered the paper in his hand. Take her, he said. The man on the right moved first. Caleb stepped forward. Fast. Not rushed. Just certain. She stays. The words landed flat. Final. The man hesitated. Silas's jaw tightened. You want to make this worse than it needs to be? Caleb didn't answer. His hand finally moved, resting on the rifle leaning against the post. The wind dropped for a second. Everything held still. Then it broke. A sharp sound split the air. Quick. Sudden. Not drawn out. One of the horses jerked back, startled. The man on the right lost his balance, dropping from the saddle into the dirt. The other pulled back hard, reins tight. Silas cursed under his breath, pulling his horse around. Dust kicked up under hooves as they turned. Caleb didn't chase. Didn't fire again. He just stood there, watching until the riders disappeared back into the rise of the land. The wind came back. Stronger now, carrying the sound of their retreat farther than it should have. For a long moment, neither Caleb nor Ivy moved. Then Caleb lowered the rifle, turned toward the house. Ivy followed. Inside, the air felt smaller, closer. She set the notebook on the table. Caleb looked at it, then at her. You should go, he said. Her brow tightened. Where? Anywhere but here. She shook her head once. No. He didn't argue. Just stood there, jaw set, eyes drifting toward the door. Outside, the wind kept moving, and somewhere beyond the hills, the men who had ridden away were not finished yet. The wind didn't let up that night. It pressed against the walls, found its way through the smallest cracks, and carried the faint smell of dust and distant rain. Caleb stayed awake longer than usual, sitting at the table with the rifle laid across his arms. Ivy didn't tell him to rest. She didn't ask him to stay. She moved quietly through the room, folding what little she had, placing each thing back into her bag with care. Not rushed, not slow either, just steady, like she'd already made up her mind. By morning, the sky had turned pale again, the kind of light that made everything look colder than it was. Caleb stepped outside first, checked the fence line. The tracks from yesterday had faded some, but not enough to forget. When he came back in, Ivy was standing by the door. Her bag rested at her feet. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I'll go before they come back," she said. Her voice carried no weight, no anger, just a plain decision. Caleb set the rifle down by the wall. "You're free now." That was all. No question, no offer to stop her. Ivy held his gaze a moment, then nodded. She bent to pick up the bag. The leather strap slipped over her shoulder, worn but strong. She stepped past him, hand brushing the doorframe as she opened it. The wind pushed in, lifting the edge of her coat. She stepped out. Stopped. The yard stretched wide in front of her. The fence Caleb had fixed. The barn leaning into the wind. The trail leading back down toward the valley. She stood there longer than she needed to. The wind moved her hair slightly, brushing it against her cheek. Behind her, Caleb didn't speak, didn't move closer, just stood where he was. Ivy let the bag slip from her shoulder. It dropped softly into the dirt. She didn't turn right away. When she did, it was slow. "I didn't stay because I had to," she said. Her voice carried back through the open doorway. "I stayed because I wanted to." Caleb didn't answer. Not then. He stepped past her instead, walking out into the yard. He crouched by the broken section of the doorframe where the wood had splintered from the shot the day before. He picked up a loose board, set it back in place. His hands worked steady, fitting it, adjusting it, like nothing else in the world needed tending more than that one piece of wood. Ivy watched him, didn't move. After a while, he stood and walked back toward the house. He passed her without stopping. Inside, he reached into a small drawer near the table, pulled out a key, simple, iron, worn from use. He came back to the doorway, held it out, not pushing it into her hand, just offering it. Ivy looked at the key, then at him. There was no rush in the moment, no pressure, just the wind moving around them. She reached out, took it. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest second. Neither pulled away too fast. Neither held on too long. That was all. No more words. The day moved on like any other. Caleb finished mending the fence. Ivy carried water from the well, the bucket creaking as it rose. They worked side by side. Not close, not distant either. Just there, together in the same space. As the sun dipped low again, casting long shadows across the yard, they stood near the fence line. The horses moved slow in the pasture, heads low, tails flicking at flies. Caleb rested his hands on the top rail. Ivy stood beside him, the key tucked into her palm. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The distance that had once filled the space between them had thinned. Not gone, but no longer something that kept them apart. The wind passed through the hills, softer now. And for the first time since that night in the church, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt held. If you stood there in her place, dust on your boots, a past you couldn't outrun, and a door behind you that never really felt like home, you might have done the same. You might have kept walking. Or maybe you would have stopped, just like she did, when something quiet inside you said, "This is where I stay." Caleb never asked her to prove anything. Not after the dust settled. Not after the silence changed. And Ivy never needed to be rescued again. What they built didn't come from promises or grand words. It came from small things. A shared morning. A hand that didn't pull away. A place where neither of them had to pretend. Sometimes life doesn't hand you love the way you expect it. Sometimes it comes wrapped in doubt, in mistakes, in roads you never meant to take. But every now and then, if you're willing to stand your ground, it becomes something real, something chosen. And maybe that's the kind of love that lasts. If this story stayed with you, I'd like to hear what part felt closest to your own road. Leave a word or a thought below. There are more stories like this waiting, quiet ones, strong ones, the kind that sit with you long after the telling. And if you'd like to walk those roads with me, you know where to find them.